So now, ladies and gentlemen, we move to Dr. MacGinnis and to a slightly later period. John has his doctorate from the University of Cambridge, but now works on a fascinating project at the British Museum, where they are helping to rebuild Iraq archaeology in this time of great conflict. I'm sure he would be pleased to answer a question about that if one should come up with a discussion. But for the moment, though, we welcome you to this paper on the Neo-Assyrian province of Tušhan. So thank you very much, John. You've got everything?
I believe so. So Professor Langton, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And thank you for the papers in prehistory which we've had, and very interesting. The older I get, the more I feel that I resemble one of those figurines that you've been talking about. Of course, prehistory is important as a precursor to the rise of the Assyrian Empire. Couldn't have happened without the prehistoric foundations. So here we have a map of the Assyrian Empire at its maximum extent, so it is around 700 BC. We're only interested today in one area, which is southeastern Turkey, and not even all of that, the stretch of the upper Tigris along there. Now, the Assyrian involvement of Turkey has a deeper history than that. We know from now tens of thousands of cuneiform texts from what we call the Old Assyrian period, so the earlier part of the 2nd millennium BC, of trade connections between Ashur, that's the Assyrian capital at that stage, south of Nineveh, south of Mosul in northern Iraq. Of trade relations, bronze, or rather tin and copper being brought in from Turkey in exchange for textiles, among other things. And that lasts for a couple of hundred years, but then fades away with the general reconfigurations happening around the middle of the 2nd millennium. And then there's a recess in Assyrian occupation, but then also a resurgence. And we have what's variously called the Middle Assyrian Kingdom, the Middle Assyrian Empire. This map is interesting because it stood for a long time, although no one can ever have believed it. The little prognosis you have down there, or proboscis maybe, is illusory. It doesn't really look convincing, but it's because there's a city here called Het or Idu, which appears in Assyrian royal inscriptions, in Assyrian lists of provinces, and we know that that came under Assyrian control. But that's actually the wrong Het. The real one is over here, east of Erbil. So the map of the Assyrian Empire now looks a little bit different from that. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about Middle Assyrian archaeology, but really one of the most characteristic things is the dunnu phenomenon. So dunnu means a fortified farmstead, and these were built, we believe, across Assyrian colonial territory. Massive establishments, as you can see. So the Dutch excavated one in its entirety in the BIAA in Syria. And actually, we have one in our area too, so slightly leapfrogging my argument, just across the river from us, and then the northern side of the Tigris. German expedition in the early 2000s excavated this mound and found a Middle Assyrian dunnu called Dunusha Uzibi, so it's the fortified farmstead of a man called Uzibu. Now, that was a very fortunate excavation. They came onto an archive of cuneiform texts studied by Karen Radner, which allow us to fix the chronology of the Assyrian expansion in this region. I should say that these dates are not exact. We can't pin down Middle Assyrian chronology to the exact year. It floats plus or minus a decade or so, but it does give you a good indication of the Assyrians coming and then going in the 13th and the 11th centuries BC. Well, those finds at Girijanu conveniently bring us into the area of the upper Tigris Valley. Absolutely stunning landscape. And it would be too much to say this was terra incognita archaeologically, but it was very underexplored until about 2.5 decades ago. There were, however, a couple of important finds. So in the 1860s, the British consul in Diyarbakir, Taylor found these two monoliths at Kurk now called Uchtepe, and it's been debated for decades whether they really came from there or not, but they probably did. There's actually two of them, one of Ashurnasirpal, one of his son, Shalmaneser III. And these give us good cuneiform information on what happened. So to put it in a nutshell, Ashurnasirpal in his campaign in his 2nd year, also in his 5th year, comes up to the upper Tigris, retakes Tušhan, so it had been occupied by the Assyrians beforehand, refounds it as a city, builds a new palace, and so on. And the other find from a long time ago, a century or so ago, is the Tigris Tunnel. This doesn't actually show the tunnel, it's just round the corner there, so I must get a different slide. So this is northeast of Diyarbakir, and it's a location which the Assyrians regarded as the source of the Tigris and would come and venerate it as such. And there are a number of Assyrian sculptures graven into the living rock, some of them with inscriptions of those kings, as you can see. So those two archaeological finds did give information on the early northern marches of the Assyrian Empire, but it wasn't taken up. I should say, yes, by the way, that this is extraordinary. This is a bronze strip from Shalmaneser III, from Balad in Iraq, and it shows sculptors actually cutting that very image that we were seeing pictures of before. So really extraordinary depiction. But it was a long uptake. So Rawlinson, in his book on great monarchies in the late 1870s, really ignores the northern part of the empire, which is surprising because he must have known that. He of course travelled through it going out to Mesopotamia. And then Hall, in his work, finishes Assyria at Nineveh, which is ridiculous, really. But it didn't take long for serious scholarships to start paying better attention. So Meissner in 1920, exactly 100 years ago, a much more detailed map of Assyria. And if we zoom in on the bit we're interested in, he identifies the town of Amida as Diyarbakir, which is going to be correct. And then other towns we're going to be interested in, Tušhan he puts here, Sinabu he puts up here, Adam Demuza there. Now, Amida is certainly correct. The rest of them, we wouldn't accept those identifications now, but nevertheless, the effort of Meissner is to be applauded. And then things really stuck. There's no real developments in the study of the northern part of the Assyrian Empire for about 6 years. It was really a backwater from the point of view scholarship. But that changed in the very late 70s. Two scholars, Liverani and Kessler, studied the campaigns, worked out we had the sequence of Assyrian fortifications, Amida, Sinabu, Tidu, and Tušhan going from west to east. And more to the point, Kessler was able to identify or make proposals for which of these sites, which of the actual archaeological sites in the region these corresponded to. And we now think this is correct. So Pornak for Sinabu, Uj-Tepe, Kurk for Tidu, and most importantly for us, Zirek Tepe for Tušhan. And then one last thing before we get on to our Tušhan narrative is Professor Martin Kurolu and others excavated at Tidu, excavated the site and came down onto an Assyrian important level, but below 7 meters of what we ungenerously call overburden. But this was all a good setting for what's happened. So both the excavations at Tidu and the historic studies of Kessler and Liverani came just the right time. We then have in the 1990s the Turkish government realising the project to build a massive hydroelectric dam at Ilissu on the Tigris, about 50 kilometres north of the border with Turkey, the dam's now been completed and the reservoir is in the process of being created, which will flood more than 100 kilometres of the river valley system, and of course huge and most lamentable destruction to archaeological sites in the course of that. Now this is just one map. In fact, there have been about 40 sites that have been investigated, but the Turkish government welcomes scholars from across the world to come in and carry out surveys and then excavations. So, and where you'll see where Zirek Tepe is, just here, is really just at the end of the projected flood zone. And we believe that the site will be affected, but certainly the whole site won't be inundated. Well, for those of us who are Assyrian archaeologists, this was an amazing opportunity to come and investigate a site like this. This is looking from the north, so it just looks like a little puddle, but it's actually the river Tigris. So we're looking from the north, from the mountains of Shubri, the kingdom to the north, across the Tigris to Zirek Tepe, and then the rolling farmland in the background there. So Professor Timothy Matthews of Akron, Ohio, started a campaign in 1997, and we had 3 years of survey and then 15 years of excavation and study seasons, takes us up to 2014 in the end. Well, if you look at the morphology of the site, the brown is the high mound and the green is the surrounding lower town. And this is actually typical for Assyrian provincial capitals. So there's numerous more examples that one can point to. And of course the method was the Assyrians would come, they'd take over the pre-existing centre, they'd make the mound their centre of operations, you might call it a citadel, it might have not been fortified itself, then built an outer wall, and then you have the surrounding town on the inside. We'll talk a little bit about that in due course. And this was part of a standard model. The Assyrians knew what they're doing. They're very efficient. They would come, create a new province, terraform or herbiform the mound in the way I just said, build a palace, install images of the king, and this was a standard package for beginning the imposition of imperial rule, and there are other bits which would follow in due course. So our first things to do were to carry out ceramic surface. So here's just a couple of the maps. These not so clear. This is the later Roman occupation, and then much smaller amounts of Sasanian occupation there. And we also started geophysical survey, in the end covering the whole of the lower town, but only small amounts of the highland where magnetometry really was very ineffective, which didn't surprise us with all the churning up and rebuilding demolition which has gone on the highland. It wasn't surprising that we didn't get good results of magnetometry up there. And then in the course of the many seasons, we excavated in many areas on the highland, many areas in the west, and not so far on the east, although they were interesting, but we won't be covering those today. So it's going to cover 2 or 3 of these excavations. This is starting with the palace area AN. It's got 2 designations because in those days, once we got to 999 in our database, we couldn't put any more numbers in. I think we're more advanced these days. So operations A and N. So here looking northwards, you've got the Shubrian Hills in the background there. And Professor Dirk Vicker, who excavated here, was fortunate enough to come right down onto the reception room of the palace. So that's this area in black here. And as we'll see in a second, a long room like this with little rooms on the side and probably some more behind here and courtyards on each side is the typical arrangement for reception rooms in Assyrian palaces and then later palaces, successor empires as well. So Dirk's reconstructed his palace this way. And of course, the light grey is conjectural. But I think he's got one thing wrong. So I think the entrance would have been on this side. You've got the reception rooms, then you'd have rooms behind the reception room normally, and then so on. In any case, from here onwards is eroded and has gone forever. But in due course, someone, not us I suspect, but other excavations will be able to recover more of the palace in that area there. So let's have a look at this throne room. Well, it's certainly not like Versailles. It is very difficult tract here. So level almost to floor level, and then many pits. You can see these pits here from medieval, Hellenistic medieval pits cut into it. But where you have these fragments surviving, these are an absolutely typical Assyrian phenomenon. You have either baked brick or limestone lines going down a throne room, which we use for moving braziers up and down to keep the occupants warm during the winter. And discovering these is quite a good corroboration that we were indeed in the major reception room. Another detail is this fragmented, but you can see it, door socket with concentric circular lipping, and that's another typical Assyrian phenomenon. Very good one for Nimrud there. And then in Tepe-Giyan in Iran, an excavation in the 1930s appears to have found something very similar, although the records from that excavation are not always so clear. I want to talk about some of the finds and what they mean. I'm going to zoom in on this one for a start. So from the floor of the throne, we found this amazing tablet. It's a cuneiform tablet dated by the Paleolithic to about 700 BC. It's a list, and lists don't always excite people, but this one's better than most. You'll see it's got a sign repeating all the way down both columns here. This is the female determinative, so it tells us it's a list of women. And clearly they're women who are in the employ of the palace. But what's really interesting is the names themselves. And so Syrian cuneiform is quite easy to read. But the names themselves are not Assyrian. And then they're not anything. They're not Babylonian, they're not Arabic, not Egyptian, none of the West Semitic languages, Luvian, Urartian, Hurrian and so on, Elamite, Iranian. They don't belong to any of those language groups. So the question is, who are these people? And the obvious suggestion is that they are going to be deportees from the border between what's now Iraq and Iran, the Zagros Mountains. We know the Assyrians deported people on massive scale, tens of thousands of people at a time. Tiglath-Pileser III in the mid-8th century deported 83,000 people to Tušhan, but they actually came from Western Syria, so they're probably Aramaic speakers. So we think by a process of elimination, these ladies probably came from the Zagros Mountains over there. So another great surprise is these fire pits. We do know they're cremation burials now. It took us a while. It took us surprisingly long to arrive at what was an obvious solution, but that's often the way in archaeology. So cut below into the matrix below the palace floor and then recovered, we have these pits full of ashes and then full of fragmented bones and fragmented artifacts. And then very notably you have these holes here, which are certainly flues. So this is where you would dig the grave pit, put a bed down, the grave goods, and then burn everything in situ and then cover it over again. Well, that's absolutely not the Assyrian practice. The Assyrian practice was to bury the dead intact so their bodies could function in the afterlife. On the other hand, burying below the floor was normal in Assyria, although, as we've heard, in other places as well. So to my mind, this phenomenon of having these cremation burials in an Assyrian palace is really a perfect example of hybridization. Incidentally, our conservators did an amazing job. A wonderful palace there, fragmented into hundreds of pieces by the conflagration. A stamp seal there, also burnt, but intact, where you see a worshipper before a goddess, quite a senior goddess. She's got 3 horns there, and possibly Ishtar, although it's not really something you can say for certainty. Well, so these cremation burials are a good example of hybridization, and the idea of cremation comes from either northwestern Syria and/or Anatolia, and then moves down towards us. So it's not so surprising that we find them on the provincial edge of the empire. But actually, after that, Professor Morandi at Tel Gomel, very near Nineveh, so central Syria, he found cremation burials as well, so right in the Syrian heartland. So I think the idea does come from Anatolia, but it moves rapidly in towards the centre of Assyria. Another interesting thing on a similar theme, so our archaeozoologist Tina Greenfield was able to show that in one of the rooms of the palace there was a large number of bones of birds and of many different species. And one possible interpretation, so the birds, they could be for dining, but not all of them are birds you would eat. And they might be for decoration, but they could also be for augury. And I've mentioned the name Shubri, that's the kingdom north of us, and Shubrian augurs were famous in the Syrian Empire. So I think it may well be that the bird bones we have here were being kept for use in augury. And in due course, when I have time, I want to look into the cuneiform evidence for augury and see whether the species we have meets the species we'd expect from the cuneiform text. Okay, moving down onto the lower town and this area there, Operation GR, we had this wonderful complex of buildings. So you can see 2 very substantial buildings built around courtyards. Now the right-hand one is really a typical house, it's called residence for a senior official. This one, as we're going to see, is an administrative building. So it may be that the eastern building was the residence of the chief scribe or the head of administration. It's just conjecture, but that might be the case. But let's have a look at those courtyards, really quite amazing. So these mosaic pebble courtyards done in checkerboard fashion of black and white stone. Sometimes just pure black and white and sometimes more ornate patterns, as you can see. Well, these are actually known as an Assyrian phenomenon, and they're found from all these sites here. The one at Rabat Tepe in Iran is a little bit different, but they're from all these sites here. And it's not a coincidence that they're from the river, from the Tigris and Euphrates, because essentially you're sent down to select round pebbles from the river, bring them back and create the pavements that way. And of course the British at Chile, in the course of that salvage work about a decade earlier, found a very splendid example as well. Okay, so talk about the function of this building, and there's a large amount of evidence for administrative use and storage. So numerous pithoi with a capacity of about 500 litres. texts which describe, which I'll come on to. Some of these pithoi stamped with official seals before baking, sealings and so on. And there's cuneiform tag, which is almost unique. I know one other tag like that, which pierced obviously for a cord to go through and tied to a bale or something or other. And then this weighs 30 kilograms, and that's exactly what it should weigh, though that's an Assyrian talent. It'll have been one of a set. Now, we didn't find any of the other weights, so that's one of many suggestions, one of many indications we have that the inhabitants of this town, they had time to gather their possessions together but before they left at the end, which we'll come on to. And then here you have a weighing scene from the Rassam stele, very fragmented now in the British Museum. And what would have been weighed? Well, most commonly metals, also textiles, and bitumen if you were processing bitumen too. And of course our archive of cuneiform tablets, they're indisputable evidence for the administrative use of this building. These extraordinary because they're from before and after the fall of Nineveh, dated by Seymour Parker 614 to 611 BC. Many of them routine to do with grain transactions, other more extraordinary. And one of them really unique. It's a letter. This format is the format of an Assyrian letter, long, thin, shaped like that. It's written by a military commander who's been asked to raise a unit of chariotery, but is right about saying it's impossible, that everyone has fled. He lists all the different components of the unit. They've all fled, and how you see how it's going to and I am, that's the same as Assyrian as in as an English Efshaku, I am done. And that's a letter which could only have been written as the empire was in the process of collapse. So you have Nineveh, the great metropolis, falling in 612 BC, a rump government surviving for a few more years centered on Haran. But we know from the Babylonian Chronicle, this text here, that Tušhan in 611, the Babylonian army passed over. So this letter was almost certainly in 611 as the Babylonians swept by. Now, I do want to talk about the tokens, and all I said about the administrative use of the building is an important precursor, because when you find objects like these, so these are all about 1.5 centimetres in size, sorry there's no scale on this. When you find objects like this, there's always an argument, are these tokens, are they game pieces, or whatever. But we found hundreds of them in this building, so to my mind there's no doubt whatsoever they were used in administration, and as many of you will know, the use of tokens in administration goes back to at least the 4th millennium BC. And many of these found in roofing collapse, which suggests that maybe they were tied up in leather bags, suspended from the ceiling. And if there's time, we can talk about what these might have been used for precisely, although that's not easy to identify, or not easy to be precise about that. But the great majority of these tokens, 400 or so, came from this one room here, room 37. The tablets came from rooms 9 and 10 here. I think this is very significant. You see that room 37 has a little back entrance onto the courtyard there, or the back space. So I do think that we had either animals arriving to be inventoried and grain brought in, or messengers bringing tokens which encoded the information on grain and animals. The token accounts entered room 37. They were then translated into cuneiform and eventually ended up in the bookkeeping system there. Well, we were very excited about this. So to be truthful, it took us a while to be excited, because we were very excited by the tablets initially, but we began to realise how important these were. And to begin with, we thought these were the first discoveries of such tokens from the Assyrian period. But that's not actually true. Tel Taina in the late 1920s and 1930s here, the Chicago expedition found a large number of tokens which, however, remained unpublished. That's going to change now. So considering those together, we created a typology of that and wrote an article in the Cambridge Journal. And there are actually token finds from quite a number of other sites as well. So from Ashur itself, from Carchemish, which is just across the road from Ashur, from Tel Sati Adep, we mentioned earlier, the Middle Assyrian dunnu, and from Tyre, and from Carchemish site, Tel Sheikh Hamad as well. So it's now clear that tokens were probably commonly in use in the Assyrian Empire, and that's a completely new find. A decade and a half ago, no one knew that at all. And the finds go on. So at Carchemish, Professor Marchetti has found the fragmented remains of the palace of Sargon, and then you'll see here a pavement just of the type that we've already been talking about. And then lo and behold, if you look close enough, you find tokens as well. So it must be that in the early excavations in the 19th century at Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad and so on, then there must have been tokens in there thousands there, but not recovered by the excavation methods at that time. So the last excavation area I want to talk about is the gate here, so discovered by our resistivity, and here you see the city wall along here, the gate coming along here. The resistivity took us 5 times as long for the same space to carry out, but it's only in 1 year that we got results as clear and obvious as this. So we did excavate the gate in the entirety in the end. Of course, the red strip there is the road, and when we excavated it, it had been built and rebuilt 4 times, so thick layers of pebbles, cobbles, and clay. And in one level, penultimate level, dozens of fragments of hands of Ishtar, which must have been decorating the gate from the earlier phase, and then clearly deliberately reburied. There's nothing, there's no pottery, no other finds, just the fragments of hands of Ishtar weighing in there. So of course the gate gave us very good evidence for the day-to-day use by the soldiers, environmental evidence, graves cut below the floor on all 3 sides, on the other side of the gate as well, and then very proud of these, a pair of loosely called knuckle bones, actually straggleized sheep, which we know from ancient texts were used as dice, as gaming pieces from long ago. Okay, so what do we know about the city? That this is one reconstruction from a few years ago. I think there's some changes to make. So we had the lower town. There was a moat going around it. And when we started, the moat was very clear, several meters deep. But in the decade or 2 of cotton cultivation, the run-in from the field has filled the moat up substantially. There is a cutting along here, but I'm quite sure that the moat must of course have gone around the whole of the city in antiquity. So the citadel mound that we've already talked about, the administrative building, and then residences. Operation G, we talked about Operation M there, Operation U and T over here. So all around the lower town were elite residences, and that's actually what we would now expect. Professor David Oates, very famous Mesopotamian archaeologist, over half a century ago said that the lower towns of Syrian cities were the place of residency. So it's not like medieval Europe where you have a high castle and then peasantry living below. One thing we haven't yet found is a temple. We know from other sites there must have been a temple here. We know from our text there was a temple here, but we haven't found that so far. Of course, the question is, why did the Assyrians do that? Well, why didn't they stay home in Ashur drinking tea? Well, they extracted huge amounts of resources from this area. I haven't got horses. They also brought horses in here. So large amounts of stone, of wood, of metal, not just for their general wealth, but also for the construction of palaces. We know that. So that was one reason for their acquisition of this territory. And let's think a bit more about the settlement. Now, from the surveys done at the time of the Illicit announcement, we had the first signs of what we now know, again we know is typical from other surveys in Iraq, is in the Assyrian period, essentially, in the mid-Iron Age, you have a large increase in settlements, and settlement numbers, and these are settlements of small size, generally 1 or 2 hectares, and the belief is, and I'm sure it's correct, that these are settlements settled by deportees. So as I mentioned, thousands of people brought in, settled on the land, where they at the same time provided the agricultural basis for the settlement and also men for the army in the summer. Now, 2 of these sites have been excavated, so Kabushan, these are both very near to Cizre Tepe by Turkish colleagues, and in both cases a rich Assyrian material culture, so typical Assyrian pottery here, a wonderful bit of stamped ware there, and very typical Assyrian cylinder seal there. And then very much the same sort of thing at Hakemi, where we have an Assyrian glazed bottle and a sauce lamp, and again a cylinder seal. So fairly clear that the inhabitants of these little sites were affiliated to Assyrian material culture. Well, that's enough about the Assyrians. Who were the other people? As we said, one way to call them is the Shubas, that's the immediate neighbours. But there is this phenomenon of grooved pottery, which is found across a very wide area. Now, at one stage, this was linked to the Arameans, but that's too simplistic or even facile. It's probably correct that Arameans did use this pottery, but of course, the one-to-one identification is unlikely and runs against all theory in any case. But you find this pottery spread across this area. The Assyrians did more or less call this region the Nairi lands, and so it does seem to be the case that, among other things, the Nairi lands, the Nairi people, although that's probably completely the wrong way of putting it, but the peoples of the Nairi lands did use this pottery. Were they Hurrian? Well, some of them probably were. We do know that in the 3rd millennium BC, there's a large arc around here, pretty much corresponding to modern Kurdistan, was occupied by Hurrian speakers, or at least that was a major element of the population there. Okay, so that's a summary of what we did. There are things that we didn't do. So I think if we were doing this project again now, we'd make more use of satellite imagery. We had some images, but not enough. And we would like to have done, with Cizre there, we would like to have done survey all around here, but it wasn't possible. So the sites, Hakma-Yuso and Tušhan, for example, were within the flood zone of the projected reservoir, so that's why they were surveyed and excavated. We didn't have a permit, we needed a separate permit to carry out survey, and we did get it 1 year, but for other reasons we weren't actually able to carry out the work at that time. So we would like to do more of that. Maybe other people will do in due course. And of course, if we were to go back to the site, there's all sorts of individual things which we might like to do as well. Okay, so lastly, if you're remotely interested in any of this, there's 2 books you can read. It's a very readable book, written by all the specialists, but very well illustrated on Cizre itself. This is also available in Turkish. And then also very recently, so Kamal and Selim, this book on the Assyrians in Anatolia, more generally, which again is in both English and Turkey. So I'm aware that there's lots of issues which are thrown up by that, but David is waving frantically at me, and I will desist.
Well, thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering if there's any early evidence for the early Neo-Assyrian Empire, Tušhan, at Cizre. I think in the written sources, Ashkenazi says that he actually found Assyrians there when he arrived. And then there's, of course, the excavation by Schaffner, where they have Assyrian presence between the Middle Assyrian period and the Neo-Assyrian period. Do you have anything similar below the palace, for example, in the High Mound, or below?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and the answer is yes, we do, in 2 or 3 different ways. Below the Neo-Assyrian palace, I should say palace, there's at least 3 versions of this palace. The middle one was destroyed by fire, which comes on to something else which is interesting too. But the Neo-Assyrian palace complex, and below that a zone of abandonment, and below that we do have fragments of the Middle Assyrian palace, I'm sure that's right. And then also in a different area, on the High Mound area L, below the Neo-Assyrian levels, we have an area characterized by pits for grain storage and very flimsy architecture, and that's characteristic of this interregnum between the Middle Assyrian and the Neo-Assyrian period. So we do have that. Let's go back to the that second palace destroyed sometime in the 8th century BC. Of course, the Hallstatt Plateau makes it complicated to date it precisely. But throughout the site, we have buildings destroyed and then rebuilt on exactly the same plan, but with a real break in between. And we're guessing this corresponds to the chaos, or at least the weakening of authority as perceived in the Syrian government in the early part of the 8th century BC. So it's quite possible that prior to Tiglath-Pileser III, Tušhan was lost to the Assyrians, or at least sacked. Yes, exactly, and then rebuilt afterwards.
Can I ask how far there was continuity between the Middle Assyrian and the Neo-Assyrian period, or was there abandonment and a real rupture in terms of occupation at sites and more generally in terms of settlement?
Well, if you start with core Assyria, it's just one empire, one story really.
But here, in this
but here, out on the periphery, there is this process of contraction and then re-expansion. So, for example, I mentioned right at the beginning, there's a site called Idu, so one on the Euphrates, one in eastern Kurdistan. And excavations there by the Dutch around 2010 found evidence for a previously unknown kingdom, using Assyrian writing on their bricks. So it had been under Assyrian control. That weakened there as a local kingdom, and then it was taken back by the Assyrians in the 9th century, or maybe late 10th century. But materially and culturally in core Assyria it's very much a matter of continuation. But then something else happens is, with their empire, they absorb lots of people, they deport people left, right, and centre, they bring lots of people into the Syrian heartland, and in the end, although Syrian language is spoken by the elite, as you can see, it's still being written in 611 BC, the real main spoken language had become Aramaic.
So is there any evidence of this hybridization you were talking about in the language, or does it remain pure, as it were?
The best way, the most fruitful line of investigation, and Geoffrey Kahn, who you may know in Cambridge, is going to do this. He started looking at it. So you have a population group in northern Iraq, you still do, of course, they suffered much in recent decades, who call themselves the Assyrians. And many people have refused to believe this identification. And it's true that they've only called themselves Assyrians relatively recently. Notice, I think they are descended from the Assyrians. And one thing is that they speak Aramaic, and so a big research question is the Aramaic of modern Assyrians, is it or is it not closely related to the Aramaic spoken at the end of the Assyrian Empire? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that's a good line of inquiry. Maybe Martin knows the answer.
There are many loanwords in Assyrian, like Madbaru, which means desert steppe, that come from Aramaic or Western Semitic tongues. An enormous amount of loanwords. And there's a professor in Italy called Mario Fallis who's written a lot about this in the 80s and 90s, about loanwords in Aramaic going into Assyrian in the 7th century, late 8th century, the Sargonid period, in the hundreds. Another Professor Chaim Tadmor studied this in Jerusalem a long time ago. So it's pretty well established. There's another word called Edu, treaties. For example, the treaties between kings in the late Sargonid period. This is a loan word probably from treaty covenant from Aramaic as well. So there are hundreds of words. I'm not a philologist. Karen Rodner will be the best person to answer the question.
That's very interesting. Any more questions for our speaker? In that case, thank you very much, and we have a cup of tea.